as we mentioned, we wanted to get a little bit of perspective from really some practitioners. So we're really thrilled to have really two folks today from Greenskies. Greenskies is and its affiliate Clean Focus. They develop, finance, construct, own, and operate clean renewable energy projects across the U.S. Greenskies and Clean Focus have installed over 230 megawatts of commercial solar. They were ranked #1 in 2019 by Solar Power World for cumulative commercial installations. Christopher Ross is well qualified to contribute to today's conversation. He's responsible for all preliminary site assessment and early stage design for large-scale ground mount projects. Chris works closely with both project development and business development to ensure that the environmental constraints are identified and addressed early on in the development process. In the early stage project development, he works with other members of the development team to analyze site feasibility and identify risks, and communicates with the utilities as well as local authorities. Chris has a master's of environment in environmental impact assessment from Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, and a BA in sociology from DePaul University. Gina Wolfman, also from Greenskies, is the permitting specialist and senior project developer. Gina is responsible for the permitting and interconnection process for large-scale ground-mounted solar PV projects at Greenskies. In the early stage development, she works with other members of the development team to analyze site feasibility and identify risks. Gina communicates with utilities as well as local authorities having jurisdiction, and coordinates with contracted civil and electrical engineers. Gina holds a JD and a certificate in environmental law from Pace University School of Law, a BA in environmental studies with a concentration in wildlife biology from University of Vermont, and a wetland delineation certificate through Cook College at Rutgers University. Gina is unable to be with us today, but through the marvel of technology, Gina has pre-recorded her comments. And if I hadn't told you that, you might not have even noticed that Gina is not here, given this is through Zoom. So hopefully the technology will work. So I've asked Christopher to unmute, and then I will start Chris's slides.
For those of you that don't know who Greenskies are, or myself, I did look at the list of attendees and recognize some names, but Greenskies is a solar company with a focus on commercial, industrial, and utility scale solar development. Started in 2009 in Middletown, Connecticut. To date, Greenskies has constructed and operates over 230 megawatts of solar projects across the United States. A little bit about myself and my team. I started at Greenskies about 2 years ago, and my primary role at the company at the time was to evaluate land for large scale or utility scale solar development. And since then, my role has evolved into project management as well. And my team within the company focuses specifically on utility scale. We do a number of other types of solar development: carports, rooftops, big box stores. Some of our biggest clients are Target, Amazon. So we do quite a bit, but the focus of this presentation today is going to be specifically on utility scale. And I have two goals here. The first is to present an industry perspective on solar development. And the second is to demonstrate that the tools for site analysis are freely available if anyone is interested in performing this type of analysis for themselves, municipalities, individuals. So I'll go through that process with you, and at the end of the presentation, include a list of tools and resources that you can use for this sort of thing. So next slide. So before we jump into site analysis, I think there are a couple terms, definitions that I want to flesh out here. When I talk about utility scale, I'm referring to any project greater than 1 megawatt AC, and typically the ratio translates to 1 to 4 acres, 4 to 5 acres generally, depending on site conditions. Major constraint would be a limiting factor which can outright prohibit solar development, and these are red flags that we are looking at early on to eliminate potentially bad sites. A minor constraint is a limiting factor which can prohibit solar development, but can be managed through proper design and engineering. And it's worth noting that a minor constraint can become a major constraint, depending on the circumstances. And then just a couple of acronyms: GIS, Geographic Information System, which is just a framework for gathering, managing, and analyzing data, specifically geospatial data; and LIDAR, which is a tool used to collect data, and it stands for light detection and ranging, a method of remote sensing useful for analyzing topography, among other things, but we typically use it for topographical analysis. Next slide. So let's go through some of the constraints that we're looking at. When we look at a site, there are really 4 key major constraints that can outright eliminate a project right off the bat. First being wetlands. Obviously, wetlands are a protected natural resource, and we can't construct in or near wetlands. We at least try not to. Greenskies standard is to stay outside of all wetlands and associated buffer zones. We apply a 100-foot buffer automatically to any wetlands and design the system outside of that. And even I'd say on most sites, you're generally going to be building projects further away because of stormwater management design. Generally between the array and the wetland, there has to be either a swale, a basin, or something to manage runoff on the site. Vernal pools, these are harder to identify using a desktop evaluation. Typically, if there is evidence of the potential for vernal pools on site, we would go out and do a preliminary site walk looking for specific things. And this is also difficult because it's time sensitive. The things that we're looking for really only occur during certain periods of the year. So that is a challenging constraint to identify, but it is extremely prohibitive, and that's due to the setbacks associated with vernal pools. Slope, obviously we want as flat site as possible. Sites with varying topography can be challenging to design the system. North-facing slopes can reduce the output because we have to increase row spacing to reduce inter-row shading. And site work associated with grading can affect the bottom line of a project, and in some cases make it economically unviable. And lastly, something that kind of gets forgotten a lot of times is interconnection, which if we can't connect a system to the grid in an economic way, a project won't be viable. It doesn't matter how good it is from an environmental perspective. If it's too expensive to connect, it's a no-go. For minor constraints, soil erosion and runoff are things that we look at. These can be managed. It depends, this can become a major constraint depending really on the surrounding area of the site. If there are significant impacts to nearby wetlands that can be caused by it, if it can't be managed effectively within the space that we have, then that can evolve to a major constraint. Prime farmland soils was something that we discussed. Obviously, this is a natural resource that there's a lot of debate on, and there are a lot of ways to protect it through proper design. And Greenskies has, on some sites, incorporated agriculture co-use. It's something that we're actively looking into, looking at ways that we can use proper seed mixes, co-locate specific agricultural uses to preserve the soil or improve the soil over time. A lot of, as was stated before, a lot of farmers, for a number of reasons in Connecticut, are looking to develop either some or all of their land. So this is important, since it's such a great location for solar. It's something that we want to identify and make sure that we're addressing appropriately early on. Rock outcrop and ledge, these are not necessarily a deal breaker, but it does increase site costs. During construction, racking typically is pile driven. If there is a shallow depth to refusal, we have to use more expensive racking, use ground screws. and that can drive up costs. Usually it's not enough to affect the project substantially, but it is something to look at. NIMBYism, I think there's a negative connotation associated with this, particularly in solar development and development more broadly. When I talk about NIMBYism here, essentially what I'm referring to is just the risk or potential risk for there to be opposition to the project due to the location and the proximity to neighbors, members of the community. Not every case of NIMBYism is unreasonable. I think that there's a range of reasons that people would oppose a project, and some of them make total sense. If the location of the project is going to dramatically affect the character of an area, that's a legitimate concern, and it's something that we want to work with neighbors on early in the development process. But again, there are also unreasonable cases of NIMBYism that should also be listened to, heard, and addressed. Automatically, opposing any instance of opposition creates an adversarial relationship from the start, which is something that we would like to avoid. Contamination, not necessarily a deal breaker, something we want to know ahead of time because there may be remediation associated with the project that is expensive and could affect the economics of the project. Rare, threatened, endangered species habitat. This is something that, depending on the species, could become a major constraint. There may be mitigation measures that we can take, things that we can incorporate into the design to reduce the impact that the project has on the species in question. And then flood zones, floodplains. These are areas that we would like to avoid. However, it is possible to design a solar project within a flood zone, assuming that you raise the racking to an appropriate height so that it's above whatever the anticipated flood level is. Go to the next slide. So what are some of the tools and data we use for analysis? So we use QGIS, which is an open source GIS program, and I'll include a link to that at the end of the presentation. Anyone can download it, and there's a number of free resources online, YouTube tutorials that explain how to use it. We use data from a number of state and federal agencies, and a lot of state and federal agencies do offer GIS tools themselves. So the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service has a great tool called the Web Soil Survey that you could just go on their website and identify a site and look at a number of different data sets on soil. And that's something that we look at in screening to identify a number of different potential constraints. So we can move on to the next slide. For interconnection, this is arguably one of the most difficult or challenging things to examine when looking at a site. In Connecticut, Eversource has a really good GIS tool called the Distributed Generation Hosting Capacity Map. And this will allow you to look at a site and look at what lines can accommodate how many megawatts going onto the grid. So when we're looking at a site, we want to make sure that there is a line that can handle the output close to the site so that upgrade costs aren't exorbitant. There are instances, like I said, where you could have a perfect site. There are few to no constraints, no issues with the site. But if it is too expensive to build out a three-phase line to connect to the grid, then it doesn't make sense economically. So we can move on to the next slide. And LiDAR, Connecticut has by far one of the best data sets for LiDAR data that I've seen. It's jointly through the Department of Environmental Protection in Yukon. They offer statewide data on this, and this is something that we use for topographical analysis, for hydrologic modeling. The wetland data that's in the United States Fish and Wildlife Service's data set isn't always accurate. So a lot of times we'll perform our own hydrologic analysis to identify the exact boundaries of wetlands ahead of time. Obviously, later on in development, we would hire a professional to perform a wetland delineation, but this allows us to screen early on without investing too much into the project. And what you see on the right here is a typical slope analysis that we perform for all sites. We break it down in brackets, so you can see it's in brackets of 5 there. Typically what we're looking at is areas above 15% are generally off limits because the racking tolerance for solar is set at 15%. Any areas that go above that would require some sort of earthwork to prepare the site for construction. So generally, we want to avoid substantial earthwork because of the effect that it has on stormwater and the effect that it has on the cost of the project. So in this map here, we would be within the boundary of the site. We'd be looking at the areas in the green as the most suitable from a topographical perspective. So move on to the next slide. So I'd like to just walk through what we would typically do when screening a site from start to finish. And I'm not going to get into all the details because there's a lot here, but I want to give you a general idea as to the sort of steps involved, what we're looking at, and the logic behind it. So specifically, what are we looking for? One, interconnection. Can the project connect to the grid and remain economically viable? The second is natural resources. Are there any wetlands, vernal pools, sensitive habitat, farmland soils, et cetera, on site? Can the project be built without causing a significant impact? Topography, is the site's topography suitable for a solar array? Will the project require significant earthwork to construct? And then risk. Does any of the criteria above pose a significant risk to the project, or does the project pose a significant risk to the site and surrounding area? So, it's not a fine line, but there is a threshold at which, there are one too many minor constraints that cumulatively make the project unappealing, in which case we would then look at other sites to pursue. So move on, next slide. So we can start with interconnection. This is the project that I'm going to present to you today is a project that we currently have under development, and it was submitted to the Connecticut Siting Council earlier this month. It's on a golf course in Stonington, Connecticut, that is closing 9 holes. They are reducing the size of, I think, from 27 to 18. And they were looking for a way to use the land that they're not going to be using anymore. And from a solar development perspective, a golf course is a great location. It's clear. It's for the most part flat. Minimal site work is involved. There are some almost man-made constraints through water hazards and whatnot, but it's something that's manageable. So you can see the site location here is close enough to a line that can accommodate the size of the project, which in this case is a 1 megawatt array. And just to confirm that is the case, we usually go on Google Earth and just look at what kind of lines are running. So adjacent to the project site, there is a 3-phase line. So we would likely need to upgrade the length of the line from the site to where you see the green feeder just southwest of the project. Next slide. So the next step would be to identify any potential natural resources limitations on site that would affect the area that we'd be looking at developing. So here we're looking at the National Wetlands Inventory data, which is provided by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So here there are wetlands on the periphery of the fairways that we'd be looking at developing on. When we were looking at this site, it became clear that within the forested areas between the very large wetland on the west and the small wetland to the east, that there's likely more wetlands within those forests. So looking at the floodplain data, that seems to confirm it. There are flood zones within that forest that likely are part of this larger wetland network. And so the map on the right is something that can be generated through a FEMA GIS tool, the National Flood Hazard Layer. and it's something that you can use yourself to identify what the floodplain risk would be for a site. Next slide. Soils, USDA NRCS has a number of a very wide collection of soil data that we use to look at potential constraints. These maps were generated using that tool. The map on the left is looking at hydric soils. So the polygons in orange are hydric soils, which indicates that there are likely wetlands within those areas, which confirms our initial belief. The map on the right is prime farmland soils. So while the site is currently being used as a golf course, it does contain prime farmland. So that is something that we're considering in detailed development. Next slide. So topography here, these two maps were used or were generated using the Connecticut LiDAR data set. Here we're looking at contour lines. So you can kind of see in the green, the lowland areas, those are really the boundaries of the wetlands that we need to avoid. That yellow area in the center is really the ideal location for the solar project. It's flat. There's no indication that there are any slope issues, as you can see by the map on the right. So we have a nice solid location we've identified with minimal constraints. We've identified the areas that need to be avoided. So now we can move on to preliminary engineering, which you can go to the next slide. So for preliminary engineering, we use a tool called Helioscope, which allows you to very simply create a project and just estimate how much capacity you can put on site or design a project with the target system size in mind. So on the left is what we had imagined based on site conditions, and on the right is the actual engineering for the project. That is the layout that was submitted to the Connecticut Siting Council that was put together by Malone and McBroom. And so it looks slightly different because you can see the basin on the southern edge of the array, which is going to be collecting runoff to protect that wetland to the south. So we can move on, next slide. So in conclusion, due diligence is important in identifying sites with few impacts to natural resources. There are a myriad of factors to consider when siting solar arrays, and perfect sites are very rare, and oftentimes trade-offs need to be made, and those trade-offs need to be weighed in what is the cost and what is the benefit of constructing the project. And lastly, the data, tools, and educational resources are freely available, empowering individuals and municipalities to identify suitable locations for solar development on their own. And on the last slide, I've included a list of resources that you can use and links to all the things I discussed in this presentation for your own use. So, and that's about it. So I think we move on to Gina's presentation, which is pre-recorded.
Hello, this is Gina Wolfman from Greenskies, and I wish I could be there live with you all today, but the timing didn't work out. As a follow-up to Chris's overview of site screening, I'll be speaking with you about site analysis and design, as well as permitting of large-scale solar projects in Connecticut. There are a couple photos on the screen on slide 1. The upper is a 1 megawatt facility we designed and constructed for Wesleyan University in Middletown. And the lower is an example of one of our landfill projects, which is in Dennis, Massachusetts, up on Cape Cod. So once we've screened and selected a site, the next step is to engage specialized consultants to conduct field studies and other due diligence tasks required for permitting, which we'll talk about later. Such efforts include topographical survey of the site and existing features and conditions, along with a boundary survey of the property line. This information is critical and becomes the basis of all future mapping and civil engineering and design for the proposed facility. We also order a title report up front, review title, to be sure that the site isn't legally encumbered in some way that would affect development of the property and the project. So field studies typically must be performed, and this is something we take much care in. We have a phase 1 environmental site assessment conducted, a wetlands delineation and vernal pool study, phase 1A cultural resource assessment, and depending on conditions that are found through initial screening with regard to regulated areas on site, other studies might be required. For example, natural resource surveys of protected state wildlife and plant species, additional cultural resource surveys, and visual simulations of the proposed project if there's a concern about visibility or scenic character. You could see a few photos or images on this slide. We have a wood turtle on the right on the bottom. That's a species that's protected in the state, and we have come across, so we make sure to account for them and include any mitigation and protection measures in our design. The upper left is actually a hand test pit or shovel pit plan that is used for the historic and archaeological work if it's recommended during the earlier assessment. And the map that's in the upper right is just a typical example of an existing conditions map or figure that we prepare for a permit application. And it includes mapping of resources that we've discovered through the field work, as well as overlays from state mapped resources. There's prime farmland on that site, and there's also the wildlife habitat that can be shown. All the information gathered during the due diligence and site analysis phase is used as a basis of design for the project for both civil and electrical engineering. In order to develop a civil engineering design for the facility with minimal impact to the environment and any natural resources found on site, it's critical to consider all relevant conditions, such as topography, hydrology, natural resources, and regulated areas on site, such as mapped core forest, prime farmland or agricultural soils, critical habitats mapped by the state Natural Resources Diversity Database Division of Fish and Wildlife, and groundwater protection overlays, to name a few. A major component of civil design is stormwater analysis and management in order to address peak volumes and water quality once the proposed project is completed. Fieldwork required by CT Deep Stormwater Division includes hydric soil verification mapping, where you take the NRCS soil map and actually go out on site, do hand shovel tests again, and compare what's found in the field to what's presented on the map. We also have to do test pits for soil analysis and observation, as well as geotechnical studies depending on the soil types found on site. So the civil engineer also determines the basis of design for the facility, including row spacing, the tilt of the panels, and the module size and wattage that would be required to meet the expected system size and capacity. The electrical engineers work with the site layout provided by the civil engineer, and they develop an electrical layout and design for the proposed facility as well, kind of working in tandem with the civil engineer. And the goal, of course, is to optimize the system's output or generation of electricity while minimizing any impacts the facility might have. And again, if there are any, the goal is to mitigate and minimize any of those. For every large-scale project we develop, we also perform a carbon debt analysis using the US EPA Greenhouse Gas Equivalencies Calculator. And that can be found at the blue link I've shown in the slide above, and it gives you all kinds of information and detail on how the calculator works and what all the numbers represent. But essentially, it estimates the amount of fossil-fired generation and greenhouse gas emissions, primarily metric tons of carbon dioxide, that are displaced by the renewable energy project. And the calculator converts greenhouse gas emissions numbers into different types of equivalent units that can be used for comparison and are more accessible and relatable to the layperson. So you can see in the chart above, this is an example of what the calculator provides as an output. Gallons of diesel fuel that are consumed, number of passenger vehicles driven in 1 year, pounds of coal burned, and energy, number of homes and the energy used for 1 full year by that number of homes. So it's a useful tool that we use in our petition, and we discuss it in the section where we're addressing air quality for our application for a permit. So as part of project development and the preparation of permitting materials for our applications, we're required to look at project benefits and do an analysis and presentation of what all those might be. So one interesting aspect that was recently brought to our attention is Lazard's levelized cost of energy analysis. And the latest version of that came out in 2018. And it actually provides a comparison of the cost of generating alternative energy versus conventional energy. So they look at solar PV rooftop residential, they look at rooftop commercial and industrial, solar PV utility scale, and onshore wind, and compare those to gas, nuclear, coal, and gas combined cycle facilities. So what's interesting is the report, or the latest analysis, shows that there's a continued decline in the cost of generating electricity from alternative energy technologies, especially utility scale solar and wind. In some scenarios, the alternative energy costs have decreased to the point that they're now at or below the marginal cost of conventional generation. And if you can see the chart, the levelized cost of utility scale solar is nearly identical to the marginal cost of coal generation today. So those numbers are coming down. Renewable energy, solar in particular, is becoming more affordable to generate, and in turn that savings and benefit is passed on to the end user of the electricity. So other than the benefit of lower or declining costs to generate renewable energy, solar in particular, there are many other benefits to developing these projects. And essentially, our projects result in either no or low impact to municipal services within any community or town our projects are sited. So we're not generating any school children who might burden or impact the school system. There's no infrastructure that the town is required to build or maintain. Typically, the roadways are private. There are access roads, and within the array and onto the project area are constructed by the developer, by Greenskies, and they're maintained by our operations and maintenance group or contractors down the road. So there's no burden to the town there. In addition, the stormwater management is all constructed and contained on site. So again, Greenskies, through their O&M division, would take care of inspections and normal ongoing maintenance of those facilities and stormwater measures that have been built to address stormwater for the duration of the project. We, meaning solar projects, again, do not demand any water, so we're not impacting the water supply or wells or any aquifers. And we don't generate any wastewater, and no concerns about contaminating groundwater or surface waters or any type of discharge, other than stormwater. So in addition, other than construction refuse, the project doesn't generate or require the removal and disposal of solid waste or hazardous waste for that matter. And the development of a site for utility scale solar actually preserves the land upon which it sits for future use within zoning and what's allowed or permitted through the town. And any of our facilities can be decommissioned down the road, either at the end of the lease term or at another appropriate time. And the solar facility will be removed and the land is restored essentially to what it was pre-construction and is available again for future development. So as far as permitting goes, the greatest challenge might be considered the fact that various state agencies and departments or divisions have competing interests. We have core forests, we have prime farmland, stormwater and water quality issues, natural resource protection, different species of plants and wildlife as noted before, historic and cultural resource protection, among others. So the Siting Council actually comes into play, and they are the regulators of projects 1 megawatt or larger. They're projects that are locally exempt, and all the utility scale solar facilities fall under this category. The Siting Council is the regulatory authority, and they're comprised of a group of people who represent members of all these various agencies and interests. So they are a group that covers all aspects of potential impact, and the process is guided through the Siting Council. And there's an application guide for renewable energy facilities. The link is there. It's a very detailed guidance document, and it specifies what's required of every applicant. And it's very similar to other states that have an environmental quality review process where specific disciplines are outlined in technical studies that must be performed and addressed as far as impact and mitigation assessment. And included, as we've discussed before, there's stormwater management, noise analysis, visibility, wetlands, watercourses, wildlife and vegetation, historical resources, in addition to air quality, environmental contamination or environmental quality. And all of these items are required of us to show we won't be impacting, and that we've considered them in our design and proposal of the project. Other items that the Siting Council looks at, they look at coastal areas, they look at ridge lines, aquifer protection, DOT scenic lands and roads, natural or CT heritage areas, and wild and scenic rivers, just really to name a handful of those listed in the guidelines. So that's all addressed. They consider all those items. And then, public safety, meaning during construction, there's traffic, operations of the facility. We have to provide all kinds of information with regard to those items as well. And when it comes to stormwater, we are required as the developer to go to Connecticut Deep Stormwater Permitting Group and apply for a general permit for the discharge of stormwater and dewatering wastewaters for construction activities. And there's an current general permit that's dated October 1, 2019. It's currently up for reauthorization this coming October, and it's in a regulatory process right now. The department has added Appendix I to that permit, which addresses the construction of solar array projects and is very detailed, puts our engineers through a rigorous design program, including all those field studies. The guidelines have design and construction requirements, and they look at everything from slopes. They regulate different categories of slopes and how the project has to be designed, how stormwater has to be managed. And they also have design requirements for post-construction stormwater management. So this is being addressed, through DEEP, through their stormwater group. And there's also a guidance for solar that came out in January So a guidance document in addition to this Appendix I that will become part of the general permit for stormwater resulting from construction activities. And right now, DEEP is hoping to get through this process and have both the guidance and the appendix through and implemented and in effect by October. In the meantime, developers are being required to follow these guidelines, even though they're not quite on the books yet. So we are actually designing to these high standards and addressing that as well. We have one more item to go over, and that's local government concerns. So the lack of authority or jurisdiction over the permitting process of these locally exempt projects is a major concern, I believe, for most municipalities. Developers are not required to comply with local zoning or land use and municipal planning documents, and they're not required to obtain permits other than building and electrical permits for construction. So it's really up to the developer to decide how and to what extent they will engage the local officials, and there's a wide range of how that plays out in the state and from project to project. Typical concerns that we've experienced or have had expressed are traffic and safety on local roadways, noise from equipment, possibly, the impact to local roads and infrastructure, and site access and emergency response. In addition, tax assessment and how revenue is generated, tax revenue is generated from a project is often an interest of municipalities, particularly town assessors. So there's no formula for that. That really varies from project to project, and that's a whole other conversation. But happy we could be here with you today. I wish we had more time. We could talk for another hour or half a day and not cover everything, I'm sure. But thank you for the opportunity. And Chris is up next, and we'd be happy to answer questions later. Thank you.